The fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous dirge above the Savannah subway station at 5:47 in the morning. Hannah Clarke wiped down the coffee cart's chrome counter with a rag that had seen better decades, her movements precise and economical, wrist rotation exactly 45 degrees, 3 passes per section, no wasted motion. The sanitizer smell hung sharp and chemical in the underground air, mixing with stale tile dust and the faint metallic tang of the transit system's endless mechanical breathing. Her hands were raw. Not fresh raw, but the kind of raw that comes from 3 months of repetitive scrubbing, fingertips almost translucent where the skin had worn through to something thinner. The scars underneath, the one she never let sunlight touch, formed patterns that only certain soldiers would recognize. Parallel lines. A map of something. She'd arrived at the cart at 5:30, before the station woke, before anyone could watch her hands shake. They didn't shake anymore. That stopped somewhere around week 2. Now they just moved. Left hand steadying the coffee urn. Right hand arranging paper cups in descending height. Left hand wiping. Right hand restocking. The rhythm was a metronome, and metronomes don't have memories. They don't remember the weight of a combat knife slick with blood. They don't remember the sound a chest cavity makes when you crack it open under incoming fire. They just move. The cart itself sat 20 feet from the accessibility gate, positioned where the station manager had decreed it should be 3 months ago. Close enough to hear the mechanical whine when wheelchairs approached. Close enough to hear every other sound too, footsteps echoing off tile, the periodic screech of train brakes, the static burst chatter of transit authority radios. The coffee cart was the last thing people noticed before the turnstiles, which meant it was invisible. Perfect. Hannah had learned invisibility long before the subway. She'd learned it first in Tikrit, in the surgical tents where the only thing that mattered was what your hands could do. Everything else was noise. On the cart's lower shelf, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag she'd taken from the Publix on Victory Drive, sat the flag. It was folded in the military manner, triangular, tight, the stars visible on one corner of blue. The flag that had draped Rodriguez's casket. Rodriguez, who'd been 19. Rodriguez, who'd written letters home to his mother in Spanish that Hannah had helped translate when his hands were too broken to hold a pen. Rodriguez, who'd smiled at exactly one thing in the entire war, and that was a dog that wandered into their forward operating base and Hannah had named it Cisco. The flag wasn't something she'd stolen. It wasn't stolen if it was given. It wasn't theft if the chaplain had pressed it into her hands 3 hours before the extraction went sideways, before her name disappeared into classified redaction, before Captain Hannah Clarke became dead weight that needed to vanish. The plastic grocery bag protected it from the sanitizer splash. The flag waited below, folded and patient. Hannah finished her prep routine at 5:52. She had 8 minutes before the morning commuters started filing down the stairs. 8 minutes before the station transformed from a quiet underground cavity into something crowded and loud. She pulled her staff polo down over her wrists, 2 sizes too large, cheap polyester that bunched at her shoulders but covered the scars perfectly. The shirt had come from the employee donation bin. Someone else's discard. It smelled like detergent and the faint memory of another person. She checked the register. $217 from yesterday. The numbers were correct. They were always correct. She made no mistakes with numbers, with inventory, with procedure. Mistakes got people killed. The coffee cart's numbers would never be wrong. The coffee cart's cash drawer would never be out of balance by even $1. She was incapable of carelessness in ways that most people couldn't understand. The first customer arrived at 6:04. A middle-aged woman with a messenger bag and a phone pressed to her ear, not actually seeing Hannah as she ordered a medium black coffee. Hannah prepared it in silence, handed it over, took the payment, made change, returned to her position with her hands folded in front of her. The woman left without acknowledging that a human being had just served her. This happened. Most of the time, this happened. Station manager Gerald Pittman arrived at 6:08, moving through the turnstiles with the careful authority of a man who discovered that a transit supervisor's badge could make people treat him like he mattered. He was tall, broad-shouldered in the way men get when they eat well and never walk anywhere, his uniform crisp enough to cut on. The badge caught the light as he turned. Pittman was 43. Hannah knew because she'd seen his hire date in the employee records posted by the break room, the ones he'd pasted there deliberately, making sure she understood that he'd been promoted 3 years running while she'd worked the coffee cart for the same 3 months at minimum wage with no benefits. He moved toward his office without acknowledging her either, but Hannah felt his attention register and dismiss her in a single scan. She was inventory. She was a line item. She was a problem he was documenting. The office was a 10 by 12 space enclosed in glass at the station's south corner, and Pittman settled into his desk chair with a sigh that said the weight of managing a Savannah subway station during the summer heat was a genuine burden. Hannah couldn't see him clearly, but she could see him clearly enough. His eyes moved to a computer monitor. His hand opened a manila folder. She knew what was in that folder. She'd seen him creating it over the past 6 weeks, adding pages, building something. Documentation. A paper trail. The kind of thing people made when they wanted to justify something they'd already decided to do. Hannah returned to her position behind the counter. She reorganized the sugar packets. She refilled the napkin holder. She did these things with the steady precision of someone operating under fire, which was the only operating speed she had left. The morning crowd started arriving at 6:30. The station filled with the sound of footsteps and conversation and the distant rumble of the inbound train. Commuters flowed past the coffee cart, most of them bypassing it for the chain coffee place closer to the platforms. That was fine. The cart was almost secondary to its real purpose, which was to give Hannah a fixed position in the station's geography. A place to stand. A place to be. A place where people were used to seeing her fail to matter. It was 6:42 when Marcus Webb entered the station from the main entrance, his wheelchair moving with practiced efficiency through the morning foot traffic. He wore a faded Marine's dress blue jacket over civilian clothes, and the folded flag, his own flag, the one from someone else's casket, was positioned carefully across his lap. His hands moved with the absence of his legs, powerful and precise. His face was a geography of scars and focus. Hannah felt something happen to her breathing. She recognized him immediately. Captain Marcus Webb, though his rank was buried now too. Marcus, who'd replaced her when she rotated out of the 5th Special Forces Group's surgical rotation. Marcus, who'd written her a letter 3 months before the extraction that she'd read exactly once and then burned. Marcus, who'd been exactly where she wasn't when the IED pattern she'd spent 2 years studying went active. Marcus, who'd taken the injury meant for the next medic in rotation and had done it so quietly that nobody even knew it was happening until he was already on the helicopter. His eyes moved across the station the way hers did, cataloging exits and sight lines and potential threats. A soldier's eyes. His gaze passed over the coffee cart and registered her standing behind it, and for exactly 2 seconds they made direct eye contact. No recognition. She was invisible. She'd become good at invisibility. But she saw the moment his brain processed something. Saw the slight pause in his wheelchair's forward motion. Saw the specific way his shoulders shifted as he continued on toward the accessibility gate, the one that should have opened smoothly but sometimes stuck if the mechanism caught wrong. Pittman emerged from his office at 6:47. He stood in his doorway with his arms crossed, surveying his station like a general surveying a map. His eyes moved from the morning crowd to the coffee cart to the accessibility gate, where Marcus was positioned now, his hand reaching for the button. Pittman's expression didn't change. He was waiting for something. Building toward something. The gate mechanism made a sound like metal teeth grinding. Hannah's hands gripped the edge of the counter. The metal was cold under her palms. Pain is information. Pain is data. The cold was information. The grinding sound was data. The way Marcus's jaw tightened was data. She processed all of it in the manner of someone who'd trained her nervous system to convert fear into observation. What happened next would change everything, though Hannah didn't know it yet. What she did know was that Marcus Webb was still alive. What she knew was that he'd found his way to Savannah, to this station, at the precise moment she was standing behind this cart. What she knew was that Pittman was watching from his office doorway, and that Pittman was building a file, and that some part of the man was aware that Hannah Clarke, the woman wiping down the coffee cart, the woman he'd been writing up for imaginary infractions, the woman he'd already decided to remove, might be something other than what her pay stub suggested. He didn't know what. But he was building the documentation just in case. The accessibility gate stuck. It just stuck. Metal on metal. The sound of it hung in the station air like a held breath, and Hannah felt her hands move toward the counter's edge, ready to help, ready to step out from behind her coffee cart and cross 20 feet of station floor. She felt every muscle fiber activate in preparation. But before she could move, something else began to happen. 7:15 in the morning, the Savannah subway station still half asleep, fluorescent light pooling in corners like spilled milk. The accessibility gate hummed its mechanical rhythm as Marcus Webb approached it in his wheelchair, the folded flag secure across his lap. The college students stood near the turnstiles, phones already raised, their laughter echoing off the tile before anything had even happened. They could sense it, that moment when someone vulnerable was about to struggle. They could smell the content. Marcus's will caught the gate's track. The metal edge caught the rubber tire at an angle that made physics matter more than intention. He jerked the wheel back. Caught again. The students' laughter crystallized into something sharper, something with teeth. One of them stepped closer, phone vertical, filming not the gate malfunction but Marcus's face, the concentration, the frustration, the small moment of a man trying to solve a problem that shouldn't have been a problem. Yo, bro, you need help or something. One of them spoke with the flat condescension of someone who'd never needed anything from anyone. The others laughed. The sound of it was like glass breaking inside a closed room. Hannah felt it before she saw it. That particular vibration of cruelty in a public space, the kind that happens when witnesses outnumber conscience. She was reaching for a fresh cup from the stack behind her cart when her entire nervous system activated at once. Her hands moved without consulting her brain. 3 steps. That's all it would take. The angle of approach was already calculating itself, muscle memory older than her civilian identity whispering the geometry of how to move without drawing attention until the moment attention no longer mattered. But station manager Gerald Pittman materialized from his office like something coalescing from shadow. He was a thin man made of resentment, his manager's badge catching the light with a dull gleam of borrowed authority. He stepped directly into her path, not close enough to touch but close enough to claim the space she'd been about to occupy. Cart girl. His voice carried. It was designed to carry, calibrated across 3 months of documentation and careful witness cultivation. You abandoning your post again? Hannah stopped. Her hands remained at her sides. The morning commuters around them sensed the shift in pressure the way animals sense weather changes. Phones lowered. Eyes that had been looking down at screens now looked up. Pittman had engineered this moment, stage-managed it the way a man with something to hide stages distractions. This is the 3rd write-up this week, he continued, his voice rising with the practiced cadence of someone reading from a script written in his own certainty. You know what 3 means. That's grounds for termination. But let's talk about the bigger issue here. Maybe you're just not cut out for responsibility. Some people are built for leadership. He paused, letting his eye sweep across the growing audience of morning commuters, the college kids with their phones still raised now recording an entirely different drama. Others are built for wiping tables. The silence that followed wasn't quiet. It was the sound of a room processing humiliation. The college students had abandoned Marcus entirely, their phones pivoting from his struggle to Hannah's face, their interest shifting like hyenas changing targets. Hannah's jaw didn't clench. Her breathing didn't accelerate. Her eyes didn't narrow. Instead, she achieved something far more dangerous, the complete absence of reaction. Her gaze settled on Pittman with the quality of a scope finding a target in darkness. Flat. Dead. The look of someone who had seen things that made petty cruelty look like a child's tantrum. When she spoke, her voice came out like a scalpel cutting through bone, precise, cold, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. You wear that manager badge the way some men wear their father's medals. Unearned and backwards. The room went dead silent. Pittman's face reddened in stages, a blooming flower of rage and humiliation. Hannah turned on her heel before he could find words, her movements economical, controlled, the kind of movement that looks casual to observers but betrays the perfect balance of someone trained to move through spaces nobody wanted them in. She walked back to her coffee cart while Pittman's mouth worked soundlessly behind her, his authority evaporating like water on hot concrete. The college kids stopped filming. Something had shifted in the texture of the morning. Marcus had finally managed to free his wheel from the gate's track, and he rolled through slowly, his eyes meeting Hannah's for exactly 1 second before he moved deeper into the station. The folded flag across his lap caught the light, white and blue fabric folded into a triangle, the kind of shape that only meant one thing. That afternoon, Hannah entered the employee break room with her lunch container in hand. The room went rigid. 3 staff members sat at the table, coffee cups halfway to their mouths, mid-sentence conversations dying like engines starved of fuel. She watched their calculations happen in real time, the equation of whether they could afford to be seen maintaining normal behavior. The verdict arrived in silence. One by one, they stood. Their chairs scraped against the tile with a sound like fingernails on slate. They left without making eye contact, without acknowledgement, the door closing behind them with the soft finality of a cell door locking. She placed her lunch on the table and saw it immediately, a new write-up posted on the employee board by the time clock. Her name in bold. The charges printed in what passed for official language, insubordination, a verbal disrespect to management, final warning. A ticking clock with a very specific number of days remaining before termination. That night, when the morning crowd had thinned to just the occasional late-shift traveler, Hannah restocked napkins and cups with the mechanical precision of someone whose hands could work while her mind occupied other territories. Around midnight, she noticed Pittman still in his office, the Venetian blinds casting him in shadows. He was typing rapidly, his fingers moving with the urgency of someone running out of time. She watched through the break room window, the view was accidental but perfect. He printed revenue reports, the pages sliding from the printer one after another. Then he did something that made the pattern suddenly visible. He pulled out a pen. A red pen. He manually altered numbers on the printed pages before scanning them back into the system, his movements deliberate, careful, the work of someone who'd been doing this long enough to develop procedure. Over the next 3 days, the pattern solidified into something undeniable. Every disabled access code issued carried a transaction record. But every 4th or 5th code disappeared from the gate logs before morning. The same group of men in expensive suits appeared twice daily, never actually using the accessibility gate, just trading small envelopes with Pittman in exchange for those codes. Revenue totals on official reports didn't match the transaction counts, a discrepancy of roughly $400 per day. Pittman was skimming the system, selling accessibility codes meant for people who actually needed them, pocketing cash that should have gone to the transit authority, doing it systematically enough that it only became visible if you could hold the numbers in your head and see the gaps. Hannah could. Her military training had made her into the kind of person who noticed patterns, who counted things without being asked, who catalogued discrepancies the way most people catalogued their own names. But that same training had also taught her exactly when not to move. What happened next happened quietly, the way the most damaging things usually do. Pittman called his district supervisor with a complaint carefully worded as concern. He spoke about Hannah creating a hostile work environment, about insubordination, about the necessity of protecting station operations from someone clearly struggling with mental health issues. His voice on the phone was the voice of a man protecting the organization, a voice of reluctant responsibility. The supervisor authorized him to begin reassigning the other cart workers. 2 days later, Marcus, who handled the second shift at the coffee station, was transferred to a position cleaning the platforms during third shift. Raquel, who usually worked weekends, was reassigned to a maintenance station 7 stops down the line. One by one, the witnesses to Hannah's competence were systematically removed from proximity to her. Her schedule flipped. Graveyard shifts now. Midnight to 6 a.m., when the station was nearly empty, when fewer people would observe her presence or absence. The isolation was systematic. It was strategic. It was the work of a man who couldn't simply push her out without creating documentation that looked like retaliation, so instead, he was making her disappear, slowly, into the noise of overnight operations where no one was watching. But that wasn't the worst part. 7 days dissolved into the rhythm of graveyard shifts, midnight to dawn, when the Savannah subway station belonged to the ghosts of commuters and the cleaning crews who scrubbed away the evidence of daytime traffic. Hannah Clarke wiped down her coffee cart with mechanical precision, the movement so habitual they required no thought, no focus, no risk of her hands betraying anything she felt. Station manager Gerald Pittman had reassigned the day shift workers with surgical efficiency. First Marcus Chen, transferred to the northbound platform. Then Delia Rodriguez, suddenly needed at the downtown terminal 20 miles away. James Whitfield, the young guy who'd watched Hannah move toward the accessibility gate without hesitation, found himself reassigned to the 5 a.m. shift covering the service tunnels where shadows were thick and witnesses were non-existent. Pittman had orchestrated it without a single explicit order, just quiet conversations with his transit authority allies, carefully worded phone calls about resource optimization and shift adjustments. The other workers hadn't needed to be told they were watching her downfall. They understood the choreography. Stay close, and you'd be next. Pittman was competent in his cruelty. That was the thing that made it worse than simple bullying. He didn't just lash out, he calculated, documented, systematized. Every reassignment looked reasonable on paper. Every isolation appeared accidental. But Hannah recognized the pattern because she'd seen it before, in different uniforms, in different desert heat, where officers who couldn't break you directly would simply ensure you stopped existing in any space where your competence might matter. The rain started late on the 7th night, not the tentative drizzle of early autumn but the kind that came sideways, that hammered against the station skylights like applause from a crowd that hated you. Hannah clocked out at 6 a.m., her graveyard shift complete, and she didn't head toward the apartment that was supposed to be her home. Instead, she found herself at the bus stop 3 blocks north of the station, sitting on the metal bench that collected puddles and regret. The cardboard box on her lap was falling apart at the edges, the way grief always did eventually. Inside it was a cracked army mug, the one from her quarters at Fort Bragg, the one from the coffee mess tent in Tikrit where she'd taught Rodriguez how to file-sling a tourniquet one-handed while reading a letter from his sister. Inside it was a dying succulent, its leaves paper-thin and translucent, something she'd tried to keep alive for 14 months and failed at just like she'd failed at everything that mattered. Inside it was the photo, Rodriguez in his dress uniform, the fabric still crisp, his smile still certain, taken exactly 47 days before the IED pattern she'd been predicting finally proved she was right. She stared at his face in the rain-blurred light, and her jaw clenched, and her hands curled into fists, but her eyes stayed dry. Dry like a desert wind. Dry like the place where everything had burned. The box felt heavier than its content should have weighed, as if grief accumulated mass the longer you carried it, as if sorrow had density and pressure and could crush you without ever making a sound. The thing about being burned, truly burned, officially dead in all the places that mattered, was that you learned to live like a ghost. You learned to occupy spaces without displacing air. You learned to speak without making sound waves. You learned to exist in the negative space around other people, the space they didn't notice, the space they moved through without friction. Hannah had mastered it. 7 days of graveyard shifts, invisible to the daytime world. 7 days of Pittman's calculated reassignments, stripping away witnesses to her competence, ensuring that anyone who'd seen her move with purpose, with authority, with the kind of calm that came from having survived worse than a station manager's petty revenge, was safely relocated to places where they couldn't corroborate what they'd witnessed. The systematic brilliance of it would have impressed her if it didn't disgust her. Pittman understood institutional power the way she understood field medicine, the leverage points, the pressure curves, the way to disassemble someone without anyone ever being able to prove you'd laid a hand on them. But that wasn't what made her chest tighten. What made her chest tighten was Marcus. He returned on the morning of day 8, and she recognized him before she saw him, recognized the distinctive squeak and thud rhythm of the wheelchair's approach, the sound of his breathing loud enough to carry across the concourse, something wrong with that breathing, something that made every cell in her body go alert and cold and operational. Hannah was wiping down the cart's counter, her movement smooth, practiced, invisible to everyone except the person who was trained to see through invisibility. Marcus Webb wheeled himself toward the main concourse and the turnstiles, and his hands were shaking. Not the tremor of someone nervous about navigating a mechanical gate. Not the anxiety of someone who'd been mocked before. The shake of someone whose body was beginning to fail at a cellular level, whose cardiovascular system was staging a rebellion his conscious mind hadn't fully registered yet. His breathing came in shallow bursts, and there was a faint blue tinge around his mouth, around his lips specifically, which meant oxygen saturation dropping, which meant his lungs weren't exchanging properly, which meant approximately 40 minutes before cardiac arrest if no one intervened. She'd done the math in the space between heartbeats. The math was always there now, automatic, the way some people calculated tip percentages. Captain Hannah Clarke calculated death timelines instead. Hannah took one step toward him. Just one. Her hands were already moving, she'd started walking before her brain caught up, the muscle memory of 100 field surgeries translating intention directly into motion, skipping the negotiations of conscious thought entirely. But Pittman appeared from his office like a cockroach sensing light, materializing in the space between Hannah and Marcus with the malicious timing of someone who'd been watching, waiting for exactly this moment. "Clarke," he said, and his voice had that particular texture of satisfaction in it, the sound of a man who'd finally caught you breaking the rules he'd specifically designed you to break. "Main concourse is off limits to graveyard staff. You're trespassing on day shift territory. Return to your post immediately." Hannah stopped. Her body went still in the way that bodies do when every muscle is clenched too tight to allow movement. Her hands curled into fists. 30 feet separated her from Marcus Webb. 30 feet and station manager Gerald Pittman, who was smiling the way predators smile when they realize they've found your weakness and it's not something they can hide anymore. Marcus's breathing became more ragged, she could hear the wet sound of it now, the respiratory distress climbing incrementally toward catastrophic. He reached for an inhaler that was clipped to his wheelchair, his trembling fingers knocking it loose so it clattered to the tile floor with a sound like failure. The inhaler rolled 3 feet away from him, and Hannah watched him stare at it like it was the most important object in the world, and she understood because it was. Her jaw tightened hard enough that she felt her teeth shift. Pittman pulled out his phone without ever taking his eyes off her, and he spoke into it with the pleasant tone of a man ordering a coffee. "I need her restricted from the main level entirely. Yes, today. Complete isolation from regular commuters. She's becoming a liability to station operations." The voice on the other end of the line said something, and Pittman nodded as if the caller could see him. "No, I understand. I'll document the infraction by end of shift. Thank you." He hung up, and he looked at Hannah with an expression that suggested he'd just solved something that had been bothering him for weeks. The college students from that first morning, the ones with their phones out, their laughter edited into digital memory, walked past Marcus without breaking stride. One of them, a blonde kid in a Georgetown hoodie, muttered something under his breath loud enough to carry the word faker traveling through the station's acoustics like a rock through still water. Hannah's vision narrowed. Her breathing changed. Everything inside her went still and focused and dangerous, the way it did in operating theaters when there were 3 seconds to make a decision that determined whether someone lived or died. She took a step toward Marcus despite Pittman's order, despite the documentation Pittman was building, despite the fact that she had been ordered to disappear and she was supposed to stay disappeared. But Marcus's hands were shaking harder now, and when he caught the folded flag that was beginning to slip from his lap, the flag that had been folded from a casket in a cemetery where she'd watched Rodriguez's sister throw dirt on the last person she'd trained from raw instinct into something resembling a human medic, when he caught that flag with hands that were trembling, everything else became irrelevant. The folded flag was blue and white and geometrically perfect in the way that only military funerals produce, the kind of precision that comes from ritual and respect and the understanding that you're handling the last tangible thing a person left behind. Marcus held it like it might shatter. His breathing was now audible across the entire concourse, not subtle, not something you could pretend wasn't happening. A woman waiting for the northbound train actually looked up from her phone, noticing for the first time that something was wrong with the man in the wheelchair near the turnstiles. Hannah's medical training, the part of her that was still Captain Clarke of the 5th Special Forces Group, the part that had performed emergency thoracotomies with a combat knife in tents that weren't meant to be surgical theaters, was calculating oxygen saturation curves and time to arrest. Marcus had approximately 38 minutes now. Maybe 40 if she was generous. Maybe 35 if his condition was progressing as rapidly as his symptoms suggested. Pittman watched her from his office doorway, watched her stand there with her fists clenched and her jaw locked, watched her lean forward like she might run, and she could see him trying to calculate whether she would actually violate his order, whether she would actually demonstrate the competence he'd been systematically erasing for 7 straight days. And that was the moment when everything changed, because at that exact second, the rain hammered harder against the skylights and Hannah Clarke stopped being invisible. She became something else entirely. She became the person who couldn't leave Marcus Webb to die in a subway station while station manager Gerald Pittman smiled from his office doorway. She became the person who was done disappearing. At 2:22 p.m., Marcus Webb's chest stopped rising. His wheelchair sat motionless near the turnstiles, his body folded forward like a puppet with cut strings. His lips weren't pink anymore. They were the color of wet asphalt, spreading like a stain across his face as he gasped, small, desperate gasps that pulled nothing into his lungs. Commuters froze. Someone's phone came up. Another. A circle formed around him, phones raised like offerings to a god who wasn't listening, and nobody moved toward him. Nobody helped. Hannah saw it from the coffee cart. She didn't think. Thinking was a luxury for people with time. She moved like muscle memory had taken over, because her hands remembered things her mind had spent years trying to forget. The cardboard tray of napkins hit the floor. The register dinged. Her apron fell away. She was on her knees beside Marcus before his next breath didn't come. His shirt tore open under her fingers. No hesitation. No asking permission. His chest on the right side wasn't moving, that shallow, suffocating absence of expansion that meant one thing and only one thing, tension pneumothorax. His lung had collapsed. His heart was getting crushed between the collapsed lung and his ribs like a bird in a closing fist. 40 minutes, maybe less, before cardiac arrest made this academic. Clarke, step away. Pittman's voice from behind the turnstiles. You're not authorized. She didn't hear him. Or she heard him the way someone hears rain while performing surgery, as background noise, irrelevant, a thing happening in a universe that no longer mattered. Her hands moved with the precision of 100 field surgeries, 100 moments in surgical tents in Tikrit where the only light was headlamps and the only clock was how fast a person bled out. A safety pin from her cart supplies? Her fingers steady as surgical steel as she soaked it in hand sanitizer. The pen from her apron pocket, she snapped it apart, stripped out the ink cartridge, left the hollow tube. The needle went between his ribs at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the exact location where air was killing him. The hiss of air escaping sounded like a breath. Marcus's body bucked, a reflex older than thought. His lips pinkened. 71% oxygen saturation climbing from the blood oxygen monitor someone had put on his finger without being asked. The crowd's phones were recording now, not out of help but out of the strange human need to document catastrophe. His eyes opened. They found her immediately, even as his chest rose and fell with the rhythm of a man remembering how to breathe. His lips moved. The sound came out hoarse, barely audible over the subway's ambient hum and the distant rumble of a train 3 platforms away. Valkyrie. Just that. Just one word. But it carried the weight of 5 years in special operations, of surgical tents and IED blasts, of a medic who'd been pulled from one assignment so a captain could be reassigned to something darker. It carried the weight of survival. Hannah's hand didn't shake. Her breathing didn't change. She sat back on her heels and met his eyes, a steady, flat stare that said everything without saying anything at all. Behind the turnstiles, station manager Gerald Pittman's face went rigid. His phone was in his hand before Marcus took his next breath. The call went through in seconds. His district supervisor, his transit authority allies, everyone he'd built relationships with through years of careful leverage and small favors. His voice was sharp, rehearsed, the voice of a man who'd been preparing this moment since the day Hannah refused to disappear quietly. She just performed unauthorized medical procedures on station property without consent, he said into the phone, his eyes still on Hannah. I need her terminated immediately and removed by transit police. Documentation is prepared. We have grounds. 42 minutes later, Hannah was in the break room with a cardboard box, loading her possessions into it with the same mechanical efficiency she brought to every task, a cracked army mug with the 5th Special Forces Group insignia worn smooth from 1,000 hands holding it. A dying succulent from her locker, its leaves brittle and pale. A photograph in a plastic frame, Rodriguez in dress uniform, the one they'd taken after the promotion, before the IED. Before the flag. The other cart workers had already been reassigned. Pittman had called them one by one, offering better shifts, more hours, weekend bonuses. All they had to do was not mention what they'd seen. Not mention that Captain Hannah Clarke had dropped to her knees and performed emergency needle decompression with equipment meant for keeping coffee hot. Not mention that a woman who'd spent months serving them lattes had just saved a man's life using nothing but a safety pin and a pen tube and hands that moved like they'd done this 100 times before. Because she had. That evening, Hannah sat at a rain-soaked bus stop outside the station, the cardboard box balanced on her lap like an offering nobody wanted. Rain hammered the shelter's metal roof with the sound of distant applause. Buses passed in a spray of water and diesel exhaust, their brake lights blurring in the wet darkness like distant fires. Her reflection pooled in the standing water at her feet, features dissolving and reforming with each ripple. She pulled out the photograph. Rodriguez in his dress uniform, his smile sharp as a knife, the smile of a medic who'd seen things that should have broken him but hadn't. Not yet. Not until the IED. Not until Hannah was being extracted by helicopter while he was being folded into a flag. The flag was at her apartment. Folded. Tight. Unfolded only on the worst days. A train rumbled beneath the street, shaking the bus shelter. Windows rattled. The sound of metal and electricity and people being carried toward destinations they'd chosen. Hannah sat absolutely still, watching her reflection shatter in the rain, and didn't move until the next bus came. 1 week passed. 7 days of Hannah moving through the station like a ghost between midnight and dawn, restocking inventory that fewer and fewer people would buy, watching security monitors from the break room because Pittman had barred her from the main concourse. The fluorescent lights above the coffee cart hummed their mechanical lament, the same frequency as the ventilators at forward operating base Shank in Kandahar province, the same frequency as the machines that keep broken things artificially alive. The doors to the platform slid open at 7:36 in the morning, and Marcus Webb rolled through them in his wheelchair, breathing differently than before. Deeper. Stronger. The blue tint gone from his lips. His shoulders sat higher, less collapsed inward, and his forearms showed the muscle definition of someone who'd been doing physical therapy without complaint. A fresh Marine Corps tattoo curved along his right forearm, an anchor and an eagle, the symbol of someone who'd reclaimed his identity. Hannah was wiping down the coffee cart, running her cloth across stainless steel with the mechanical precision of someone who'd learned to disappear into small tasks. She didn't look up when the wheelchair approached. Didn't need to. She'd recognized the particular squeak of that left wheel, the specific rhythm of Marcus's breathing, the weight of his presence in a room like atmospheric pressure dropping before a storm. Marcus rolled to a stop 3 feet from the counter. The folded flag lay across his lap, the corners creased with obsessive care, the fabric faded from 14 years of being touched by grief-stricken hands. He leaned forward slightly, and when he spoke, his voice carried the rasp of someone whose lungs had been reassembling themselves, word by careful word. Valkyrie. The cloth in Hannah's hand went completely still. Not a tremor. Not even a breath caught audibly. But the stainless steel beneath her fingers reflected something sharp and clinical, the same expression she'd worn in Tikrit when someone spoke her call sign in a war zone, and that meant danger, that meant recognition, that meant the invisible was being seen. She raised her eyes to meet his, and Marcus saw in that single moment why the 5th Special Forces Group had called her by the name of Norse warrior women. Why soldiers under fire had learned to stop panicking when they heard her voice. Why the medic who'd replaced her in Charlie Platoon had survived 3 years longer than any of his predecessors. A Marine standing 12 feet away, young, maybe 23, with the particular bearing of someone recently returned from deployment, heard the word. Heard it and froze mid-stride. He pulled his phone from his jacket pocket with the deliberate movements of someone accessing something classified, something normally restricted, something that had been declassified exactly 48 hours ago in response to a retired general's direct request to the Pentagon. He turned to face Hannah, and he read from the screen in a voice that made other commuters stop moving through the station, made the morning stillness develop weight and substance. Captain Hannah Clarke, 5th Special Forces Group, Silver Star for extracting 12 wounded soldiers under fire in Tikrit, Iraq, March 2012. Under conditions of sustained small arms fire and 1 active IED threat, Captain Clarke performed an emergency field thoracotomy using a combat knife and performed chest cavity drainage with equipment improvised from ballpoint pen components. All 12 soldiers survived immediate transport. Citation signed by General Marcus Whitmore, United States Central Command. The words hung in the station like a decompression chamber, like the moment between the trigger pull and the bullet arriving, like the instant before a monitor flatlines. The Marine kept reading, but his voice had begun to shake, and passengers who'd been moving became rooted in place because something was happening here, something important, something that made the ordinary station walls seem too small to contain. A figure descended the stairs from the upper platform with the measured pace of someone accustomed to command. Silver eagles on his shoulder. 2 of them. A 2-star general, dressed in Class A uniform despite it being Thursday morning, moving with the specific gravity of institutional power. He froze mid-stride when he saw Hannah. His eyes tracked to her chest, to the combat medical badge pinned there, to the Bronze Star ribbon hanging beneath it, and something shifted in his expression like a landslide, like the moment a soldier recognizes a legend. He came down the remaining stairs and stopped directly in front of the coffee cart. His right hand came up slowly, deliberately, in a salute executed with the precision of someone who'd performed it 10,000 times. Not a casual gesture. A salute that meant respect, that meant recognition, that meant the hierarchy of the room had just reorganized itself completely. Pittman exploded from his office door like a broken circuit. His face had gone from its usual pale pink to something closer to arterial red, and his voice came out in a shriek that echoed across the platform. She's fired. I terminated her. This is my station. She's trespassing. Security. Nobody moved. Nobody acknowledged him. The general held his salute for a full 5 seconds, then let his hand fall, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet enough that only Hannah could hear, but the acoustics of the station carried it anyway. Captain. Welcome home. A Transit Authority police lieutenant, name tag reading Halloway, with the particular weathered bearing of someone who'd done a full Navy career before civilian work, had his phone out. He wasn't calling for backup. He was showing the phone to Ahmed, the IT technician, who'd emerged from the security office door with the calm expression of someone who'd been preparing for this moment for exactly 6 months. Ahmed spoke with the measured clarity of someone providing a deposition. Army Reserve, he said. 2 tours in Kandahar. I maintain the security systems here. I backed up every frame of footage from the last 6 months. Every single frame. Including Manager Pittman at 3:17 a.m. on 14 separate occasions, deleting footage. Including Manager Pittman meeting with individuals in the north parking lot who handed him envelopes containing approximately $4,200 in cash per transaction. Including Manager Pittman deliberately ignoring a disabled veteran struggling with the accessibility gate while monitoring a specific employee to document her response. Including Manager Pittman writing false disciplinary reports and posting them where staff would see them and avoid her. Pittman's hand went to his phone. His fingers fumbled. Shook. He dialed his district supervisor and got voicemail. Called his transit authority allies. Call after call going straight to voicemail, because they were already in conference rooms with internal affairs investigators, already reviewing the same footage Ahmed had backed up, already calculating how far away from this situation they needed to be. The lieutenant began playing video on his phone, and the general leaned in to watch. Pittman meeting with well-dressed men who opened briefcases. Pittman deliberately writing discipline reports while watching the security monitor of Hannah moving toward Marcus at the gate. Pittman with his hand on a keyboard at 3:17 a.m., his screen showing file deletion progress, 10%. 35%. 67%. Pittman checking over his shoulder like a thief in a building he thought he owned. Marcus rolled his wheelchair directly in front of Pittman. His voice came out steady and strong, the voice of someone whose lungs had been reassembling themselves with purpose. "She taught me how to tie a tourniquet one-handed," Marcus said. "When I caught shrapnel from the same IED pattern she'd predicted would show up in Sanjan Valley, I was lying in the dirt knowing I had exactly 4 minutes before blood loss would make me unconscious. I tied my own tourniquet. Because she'd taught me. Because she took time with a replacement medic when she didn't have to. When she had wounded soldiers and 3 minutes before extraction. She trained me anyway." Pittman stepped backward. His office door was behind him, but 2 transit police officers, both veterans, both from Ahmed's backup confirmation call, had positioned themselves against the frame. His phone buzzed. A text from his district supervisor, "Don't come in tomorrow. Internal Affairs will contact you." Hannah set down the cloth. She turned her full body to face the crowd that had accumulated, the general, the marine, the lieutenant, Ahmed in his security uniform, Marcus in his wheelchair, commuters frozen mid-morning with their phones recording, with their expression shifting from confusion to recognition to something that looked like shame that they'd never known. She placed her hand against the bridge of her nose, just for a moment, and breathed. Then she straightened. Fully upright. The ghost posture that had kept her invisible for 6 months simply evaporated. Her shoulders came back. Her chin lifted. She looked directly at the general and then at each person in sequence, Marcus, Ahmed, the marine, the lieutenant, and her eyes carried the weight of Tikrit, of Rodriguez's casket flag, of 12 soldiers who'd walked into extraction because she'd been in the field tent deciding who lived and who didn't. "I need to make some calls," she said. Her voice carried no question mark. No deference. No apology. She sounded like someone who'd been holding a perimeter alone and had just watched backup arrive. Pittman's district supervisor first. Then the Transit Authority Fraud Division. Then I'm going to sit with Marcus and teach 3 young Marines the difference between proper and improper tourniquet application. Then I'm going to redesign this station's accessibility protocols. Then I'm going to mentor every veteran working in this facility. Anyone have a problem with that schedule?" Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The only sound was the sigh of the sliding doors as a new group of commuters entered, unaware that the temperature of the room had just dropped 14 degrees, that the atmospheric pressure had changed, that the quietest person in the station had stopped being quiet. A young woman in a wheelchair entered behind the new group of commuters. She moved smoothly through the accessibility gate, the one that now had proper signage, proper maintenance, proper respect for the people who used it. She didn't struggle. Didn't film. Didn't expect to be mocked. She simply moved through her morning like it had been built for her dignity, which was precisely the point, precisely what mattered, precisely why Hannah was about to spend the next 7 years redesigning every accessible facility in Savannah with the same precision she'd once used to perform emergency surgery in a tent surrounded by artillery. The general offered his hand to shake. Hannah took it, and his grip was strong enough to communicate what the salute had begun: respect earned, trust rebuilt, invisibility finally ended. By the time 6 months had passed, Pittman was loading supplies into a medical van in the parking lot above the station, performing court-ordered community service, his Transit Authority badge replaced with an orange safety vest. The judge had given him the choice himself: 18 months of driving medical supplies to veterans' clinics, or 6 months in actual jail for embezzlement and fraud. He'd chosen the van. It seemed easier than facing himself. Hannah stood on the newly renovated accessibility platform, wearing a simple jacket with small captain's bars pinned to the collar. No longer hidden. No longer erased. No longer running from the existence that had tried to burn her away. 3 young Marines approached Marcus, asking about the woman whose hands had been steady enough to open a chest cavity with a combat knife and whose decisions had saved their brothers. Her call sign was Valkyrie, Marcus told them, and his voice carried pride the way some people carry flags. She could perform a thoracotomy in the dark with what she had and save your life before you knew you were dying. She saved 12 soldiers that day. She's been saving people every day since. If you've made it this far, you know that the quietest people in rooms deserve more attention than the ones doing all the shouting. Subscribe. Like this video. Comment, what would you have done if you recognized a legend standing at a coffee cart? Hannah Clarke's story doesn't end here. The Pentagon's already contacted her about a new role, training field medics for the Army Reserve. But that's a different video entirely.